An old showbiz cliche insists the show must go on, and so it is in Hollywood. Well, at least in part. Oscar nominations are out, even if the tragic fires in Los Angeles continue to rage. And that means there may not be an actual Oscar ceremony this year. Well, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, I can see how they think it feels a little bit unseemly with so much destruction to have all these pretty people dress up and get little golden trophies. But anyway, I'm one paragraph in and I digress. So today, we're going to talk about the Oscars, not the ceremony, but the actual movies that have been nominated. And if you didn't know, this is Adam Holz. I'm your host of the Plugged In Show, Focus on the Family's weekly conversation about entertainment, pop culture, and technology. Sitting in for Paul Lacey this week, even though I'm not sure why, because he's right here, and I'm joined by Bret Eckelberry as well. You know, we love talking about entertainment and technology and how it impacts your family, and we hope that as we gather each week, we can give you something that really helps you to navigate those areas. So thanks so much for joining us. Oscar nominations. I mean, if you're a movie critic, and we are, it's kind of like Christmas, only it may be Christmas where people get you really weird gifts.
Presents that you don't want.
I don't know that I wanted that.
In the plugged-in world, sometimes it can feel like a Christmas full of coal. You know? Exactly. Really, really, really dark coal. I don't know if you know. I was trying to think of like what's a bad kind of coal, and I couldn't. I realized
only know the one kind.
I'm halfway into that metaphor, and there's no exit.
No going back. Okay. No going back.
And in our second segment today, after we talk about the Oscars, Bret is going to tell us about a new, we'll call it Christian adjacent movie, Green and Gold. But before we get going, I would love to remind you that the Plugged In Show is a part of Focus on the Family. We are a donor-supported ministry, and if you have enjoyed listening to or watching the Plugged In Show, we would invite you to say thanks with a donation. And you'll find a link to do that on the episode notes for today's show. And if you didn't know it, you're like, watch the Plugged In Show? What? I can do that? Each episode is now on YouTube. So if you want to see our beautiful faces, and if you don't, I won't hold it against you. That's okay. You can find us on YouTube. And if you're connecting with us there, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as well as hitting that notification bell. Because, you know, when it starts ringing, like Pavlov's dogs, you'll be like, it's time for another episode of the Plugged In Show.
That's right. Every time you press that button, an angel gets its wings.
Oh, I know what that's from because I finally saw it.
You did finally see it.
Well, let's get going. We always start with an icebreaker question, something, fun and related to what we're talking about.
Sometimes.
So, except for when it's totally different. Right. Thank you for that, Paul. So the Oscars are fun because we get to pick apart other people's ideas about what they think is good. And we get to be the smartest guys in the room because none of those 6,000 people who voted are actually here to defend themselves.
Sure, we just get to tell them they're wrong.
So I thought before we talk about the official Oscar nominations, I would just ask you guys straight up, what's your best picture of 2024? And maybe it's one that's already on the list or not, given the coalishness of it.
Yeah.
See previous. Yeah. Or maybe it's something none of us have heard of except Paul.
Paul, that seems like an invitation.
He's digging deep.
So I was a little bit surprised that Sing Sing was not nominated. Now, this is an R-rated movie. This is not a plugged-in approved movie, but we did have a chance to talk about it even on this very podcast.
We did.
Because it had some really interesting messages about redemption, right? It takes place in this prison where these people sort of gather together to put on plays, and we see the redemptive power of that type of story within their environment. Coleman Domingo actually got a nomination for Best Actor.
I saw that.
So that was encouraging, but I did think that the entire movie deserved a little bit more recognition.
And we might be able to find a couple slots on the list we could bump out.
Yeah, no doubt.
And I interrupted you because you were pointing at me. Just say, don't interrupt.
Because when you host this show, Adam, I always have to give a second answer.
I know.
I'm going to say The Wild Robot as well.
That
really
Wild
should have
Robot.
been nominated.
Nice.
I really liked that movie.
Yeah. So I'll say, so there are two movies. One was on the list.
You've learned from Paul,
That's
right?
That's right. In fact, I'm going to add to that, actually.
So goodness.
There's one that was on the list, Dune Part 2, which I thought that was one of my favorite ones. Just a lot to chew through. Very well done movie. That was a nominee. One that wasn't a nominee, at least not for Best Picture, Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul. That's one of the movies that I enjoyed the most this year that I watched for sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And if I can just add one more in another category.
No, two's the limit.
No, I got to go for 3. I got to top Paul.
Do you want me to call you
and
Paul
then you
from
can,
now
and
on?
then you can do 4, Adam, if you
No,
want.
I got 1, and mine's lame.
Horizon, the Kevin Costner Horizon movie. I wouldn't have selected
What?
for Best Picture, but Best Cinematography. I'm skipping to a different category.
That's fair.
But
all 4 hours of it?
all 4 hours. I say what you will about it. It definitely had its flaws, but it really captured the beauty of the American West. So
Okay.
Yeah, and we did a long talk on Westerns, so I know
right.
you're appreciative.
I
of
think
that.
something happened when he did Dances with Wolves. It got into him, and it's never fully left. But anyway,
Yeah.
another podcast for another
Another
time.
podcast for another time.
So I got to go with Dune 2, which feels like an
Yeah.
extraordinarily unimaginative answer.
It truly is.
Thank you,
sometimes
Paul.
they get it right.
See, when I set up the spike for Paul to just blast it in my face, boom, down comes the fist, ball in the face. And that's the kind of love we have for each other.
That's right.
So there were moments in that film, speaking of cinematography, where I almost gasped out loud that it was just so beautiful. And combined with the music, you probably know who's the guy who did the music.
Was it Hans Zimmer?
Yes, it was Hans Zimmer, and he used a new synthesizer that's brand new, that's never been really used before, and it can do things that synthesizers have never done before. And now I want to buy one because of that. Because of that movie, I want to be able to make Dune sounds in my own home.
Well, the infrared scene on that one planet, everything. It was super, super creative.
Yeah, and there's the one scene where the Sardaukar, I think, are climbing up like a cliff.
Yes.
And we see them in
Those are the bad
silhouette.
guys.
Those
Well,
are the
some
bad
of the bad
guys.
guys.
Yes.
Mostly bad guys.
Yeah.
And man, and when we talked about Dune, I probably said this. So if you're a super fan of the Plugged In Show, you're like, dude, you already used that one. I'm sorry. Now you know how Paul feels all the time. But Denis Villeneuve, who's a French Canadian director, he said he has been storyboarding Dune since he was a teenager. So it really was a labor of love for him.
It shows
and I
in
think
the best possible way.
I think it shows. And the story, it did give us a lot to talk about. So you can go back and find that episode as well.
Yeah, that is going to be part of our Plugged In Rewind series. It's actually just coming out.
there you
so when this podcast release, it will just have dropped or will be about to drop. So be
Either
sure
way,
to check
there's
that.
dropping.
There's dropping. There is a dropping.
That sounded funny, but
Nah,
you know,
yeah, maybe we
edit it out if you need to.
that feels awkward now. But I got to riff on that a little bit because I tell you what, the battle scenes in Dune Part 2, they were amazing. Amazing. I haven't seen an effective battle sequence since Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think so too. And there's an immensity to the story. Like this is a story with gravitas, right?
Absolutely.
So, well, let's talk about news stories, some of which have gravitas and some of which, frankly, have other things. And we're going to have to come up with some other adjectives to describe some of those.
They get a little messy.
Yes.
Yes. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to just read the list. There are all of 3 of these movies on this list that if I were not working in the biz, I would have heard of. And so those will be sort of self-apparent. And I figured we just maybe do a little short summary of the other ones so that we can bring people up to speed and then talk about. We're just going to have a very free-flowing conversation that's mostly unscripted, and see where it goes.
Best kind of
And I mean,
conversation.
I have a script, but Paul's here, so there's a good
Sure.
chance.
Yeah.
Paul, I've really picked on you a lot lately, and I apologize
Well,
kind of
we
for
haven't
that.
seen each other in
Yeah,
person
I
for
feel
such
like
a long
I'm
time.
catching
right?
up.
It's
All
all
right.
pent up.
We're making up for lost time.
So, nominated for Best Picture, and these are the best movies last year, calendar year 2024, are Anora, The Brutalist, which sounds like a really mean movie, A Complete Unknown, which is one of the 3 that I would say you might know something about. It's a Bob Dylan biopic, so really that's as much as you probably need to know about that. And Timothée Chalamet, I think he was in every movie this year.
Yeah,
It
or
almost seems
Chalamet or
Shamalama.
no, I can't. I always get his name wrong.
Chalamet.
Chalamet. I always want to call him
Chalamet.
Chalamet, but it's Chalamet. It's close but different. Conclave, Dune Part 2, Amelia Perez, I'm Still Here. That's my favorite, Paul. I'm Still Here. No, actually, I didn't know anything about it before this morning. Nickel Boys, The Substance, and Wicked. And so, we've talked about Dune 2. You got a sense of what that's about. Wicked is based on the Broadway play of the same name. And it's kind of one of, it's kind of one of those if you know things, right? People who love Wicked, man, they love this movie. But we'll talk about that maybe a little
Adam,
bit more.
how do you feel about this movie?
I was extraordinarily underwhelmed as a non-Wicked loving person. I'm like, well, that was a movie. Didn't really do much for me. And we'll talk about, I don't know, of everything on here, that's the one that I might slot in something else instead.
Yeah, well, anyway.
But anyway, so what are these other movies, Paul? I think you saw them all. So
yeah,
I'm gonna
not quite.
toss the ball over to you. Give us a little short summary, and Brett, you can chip in too. But I literally think Paul may have reviewed all of the rest of them.
Yeah, no, not so much. We actually had a pretty good even split on some of these.
Okay.
So
That's fair.
Emily actually reviewed Nora, which was a good thing for her to review. It's really essentially, it's sort of like Pretty Woman with a lot more sex. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's about this sex worker who essentially marries this Russian oligarch, and it's
Which
presented,
is Russian for mobster.
Yeah, exactly.
Pretty much.
And it's sort of presented as this romantic love story.
Yeah.
Right? Emily did not find it romantic at all. She found it to be very dispiriting, very depressing, even besides the content issues, which are many.
Myriad.
Yes.
Legion, one might say.
Yes, yeah. Just as an aside, as we get into this conversation, one of the things that struck me, we have a pretty even split between R-rated movies and movies that are PG-13 or nicer.
Which isn't always the case.
Which is not always the case. But the thing about the R-rated movies this year, they feel like a harder R than
They're
we've seen
really
in the
R-rated.
past. Yeah, they can be really, really difficult. And Nora is one of those.
Well,
I will just go on and say I did a little study of my own a while back that in the last, it was either 20 or 30 years, exactly 50% of the movies nominated have been rated R.
That's interesting.
So
yeah, and
you were going to say something.
I would just add the non-rated R movies this year, PG movies that have been nominated as well, wouldn't necessarily consider them family friendly or family appropriate either. Conclave, one of the nominated movies, revolves around the Catholic Church and the College of Cardinals choosing a new pope after a pope
that's
has
where
died.
a bunch of birds get together and go to school
is
together.
not
That's right. Yeah,
always
cardinals are
sounds funny to
red
me.
birds that no. Yeah, so it's talking about that, but it dives a lot into identity, politics, sexual identity, gender fluidity, all sorts of things like that, and PG movie.
Yeah.
So these themes are not. There may not be what you'd expect.
Right.
Right. So when you look at the rating and you see a PG, you say, "Oh,
that's my
Conclave.
movie."
Let's take my 8-year-old to this."
I don't know what that
Maybe
word means,
not.
but let's go.
Yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Brett. A conclave is actually the very specific and technical Catholic jargon for the meeting that's called to select a new pope.
Yes.
Is that, am I right in that?
All of the cardinals come together in the conclave, and then they select the new pope. They vote for the new pope.
Yeah.
So we talked about A Complete Unknown. Oh,
Did we talk about A Complete Unknown?
well, I mentioned that it was the Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan,
Yeah.
biopic. His earlier years, I would say, right?
When he
Yeah.
looked a lot like Timothy Chalamet. So weird.
Well, and I would say crucially, you can correct me if I'm wrong, not necessarily maybe including the part of Bob Dylan's life where he came to faith,
Correct.
right?
Right. That was a much later addition to his repertoire, if you will. You know,
It is an earlier focus. And I remember, I believe Bob Hoos reviewed that one. And he said it was a very linear movie. He said technically it was really well done. It was beautifully shot. But I think sometimes with biopics, we sort of expect some kind of unpacking. And he said it was just sort of okay, this is what happened to Bob Dylan. Like almost not quite documentary style, but maybe in that neck of the woods.
Sure.
And I think he was maybe hoping for something a little deeper and didn't really get it.
Yeah.
So did you see The Brutalist, Paul?
I did see The Brutalist.
If I were, is that about a really mean person?
It is not about a real. Well, it sort of is.
Because it
actually.
sounds like it, right?
Yeah, no, it really talks about brutalist architecture.
And what is that? I'm not. I mean, I wasn't before I read your review.
Yeah,
I'm pretending ignorance now.
When you think about brutalist architecture, it's a lot of concrete, a lot of very harsh angles. If you think about buildings that are really popular in the Soviet Union back in the 1980s, they are sort of brutalist, right? They are heavy, they are strong, they are formidable. And so this is really about this, but many people find them beautiful too. There's a purity to them. The starkness makes them feel pure. And so the story really revolves around this immigrant from Bulgaria, I believe, who comes into America. He was once a really, really popular architect back there. He's nothing in America. And so it's sort of this story of him moving forward, trying to make a living, trying to bring his family over. And he's sort of rediscovered by this very, very rich tycoon who gives him a chance to design a building. It's a very interesting story, and it would have been more interesting had it been 2 hours instead of nearly 4.
It was brutally long as well.
It was brutally long.
And it was also a fictional story, correct?
It was a fictional story, which is interesting.
See, I was confused because I would say with the subject matter, I thought it was lending itself to be another biopic.
Right. And that's what I
thought
originally...
it was too.
Yeah.
That was what I originally thought too. And I will confess something.
You were
After
wrong.
I saw it, I said, what is up with this? And so I was looking up the name of the architect. No architect whatsoever. So
they got you.
They totally got me. It was a very well told story.
A not true story in the form of a true story.
That's a new one, yeah.
Yeah. And you would think if they were making up a story, it would have been more exciting. But that's beside the point. I think that it was a really well crafted movie. You could tell the skill that went into it, but it's a chilly movie. It is a lot like brutalist architecture, in fact, where I think a lot of people could see the beauty on it. It left me feeling cold. It left me feeling a little bit off-put. And there are some really serious content issues, the biggest of which gets into a spoiler, so we won't get into that here. But yeah, there are some really serious content issues, not pervasive throughout the movie, but definitely there are moments where you say, oh, goodness me, did that just happen?
So, Bret, unless I'm missing my guess, I'm Still Here is the one movie that we haven't yet reviewed, right?
You are correct.
Tell us about that one.
Yeah, so to give just kind of a brief summary of what it's about, what I'm aware of that it's about.
Right, and now we're making things up, just disclaimer.
So it is about, its focus is on a mother who is in Brazil. Her husband actually is kind of a political activist. I think he served in the government earlier on in Brazil. They come back to Brazil as kind of this dictatorship is taking hold in the country. So her husband is still trying to be a political activist. He gets taken. And so it really focuses on her really trying to reinvent herself in the wake of her husband's disappearance, keeping her family together, and just kind of her life as it proceeds from there and how Brazil as a country sort of evolved over that time as well.
Wow. You know, it's funny as you talk about that, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember seeing that trailer. But, you know, sometimes this is the nature of the Oscars, right? There's stuff that barely makes it to the outermost ring of the radar before it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
And
there are a lot of movies.
This kind of feels like that.
There
right?
are a lot of movies
out there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When you think about, you know, we have in the critic world, we have, you know, this Oscar season. It's when all the Oscar movies, the hopefuls, sort of start rolling out. I mean, there's probably 40 or 50 that are Oscar hopefuls. When you look at the list that
and now most of them are Oscar disappointments.
Well, that's exactly right. You know, it's really interesting to see how many movies sort of fall by the wayside.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So the big winner nomination-wise is Emilia Perez, which you saw.
I did see that.
And what a different kind of film.
What a different kind of film. It was... Yeah, I do have to say, it was one of the more interesting movies that I saw this year.
You kind of liked it in terms of it working as a movie, if I remember right.
So
it's got some things going on.
Well, it's got some things going on. Yeah. This is a Netflix movie, and it essentially is about this drug dealer who wants to make a pretty significant change, wants to move out of this business, but he wants to make a radical decision to move from being a male drug dealer to a woman, and sort of contracts
it's
a
like
lawyer.
witness protection to the next level, right?
And so he contracts this lawyer who helps sort of move him into that direction. The first third of the movie is really about that journey, maybe the first fourth. But then the last part of the movie is really about him now as a woman and how he is processing his life and how he is moving on, and how this change, the movie says, how the change has redeemed him, made him a better person.
Because everybody thinks he's dead, right?
Everybody thinks
including
he's dead,
his whole family,
including his kids. And one of the most poignant scenes in the movie is she, Emilia Perez, is now tucking what had been his child into bed. And the child sings this beautiful song about how Emilia Perez smells, how she smells like his father. And it's really powerful. And the trans actor who is also nominated, his name is Carla now, did a really fantastic job embodying both this male and female character. So from that perspective, in terms of how it operates as a movie, is really fascinating. But clearly from that description, that there's like some huge problems here.
Right.
So the thing that I found really fascinating about this movie from a plugged-in perspective, and I mentioned this in the review, is that for decades, for centuries, we have all felt this hole, this longing, this hole in our heart that we try to fill by other means. How can I make my life better? And we Christians know that answer is it's filled by God. Society continues to try to find other things. In the 1950s, 1960s, it was science. It's sometimes
UFOs.
It's individualism, not UFOs. I don't think. Maybe for a small subset.
Haven't you seen the movies from them? It was totally UFOs.
They're everywhere.
But when you think about Emilia Perez, it is emblematic of how we look at ourselves. We see, I am lacking something. I am longing for more, and what can fix me?
Yeah.
My sexuality. And that is what this movie is all about. It's a fascinating exploration from that level.
I mean, it sounds very existential.
Yeah.
I mean, my corny jokes aside, it's where do we find meaning and purpose and identity?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it sounds like the movie takes a turn certainly away from a Christian understanding of how God has designed us, but the questions are still
The
questions we all grapple with.
Yeah, and essentially the movie says that this person is redeemed through changing that sexuality. And that is a fascinating theme. It's a disturbing theme, but in terms of, it's just fascinating where the movie went to.
So what do we have left? We've got Nickel Boys and The Substance.
Well, I'll talk about Nickel Boys.
I was going to say, but Brett, why don't you do...
Paul can talk about The Substance.
Right?
I can't wait.
I mean, we just had the first feel-good movie of the year, and we can follow it up with the second one, right?
Right. So Nickel Boys, it chronicles kind of the story of two friends, two African-American men who grew up in this reform school in Florida. Now, this particular reform school was noted for some pretty horrific abuses of the kids that attended there. So it's really just kind of chronicles their journey as they go, and they kind of, as much as they can, fight back against some of the injustices that are being done in this place that is, I mean, it's ostensibly supposed to protect and help children.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's a reform school, and yet some of the kids never even made it out.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it's pretty grim.
Yeah.
Yeah, grim story.
A grim Oscar movie?
Imagine.
Who would have thunk?
Who'd have thunk? Who'd
All
have
right, I
thunk?
think The Substance is our last one, and
Yeah.
we've saved the
Let's-
quote best unquote for last.
Speaking of grim, yeah. Wow. So we've talked a little bit about this movie in the Plugged In hallways.
Oh man.
And I have mentioned a couple of times that in my history here at Plugged In, and the history is
Which now
getting
goes
longer and longer.
back almost before the internet.
It's a little crazy, but it may be one of the craziest movies I've ever reviewed. It's essentially about this aging actress played by Demi Moore. She is finding herself getting shunted from her world of celebrity because she's getting older. She actually is sort of this Jane Fonda character who has become famous for exercise, right? She has this exercise show. She's very popular, but she's getting older. And her boss, essentially, played by none other than Dennis Quaid, he says, we need to find someone younger. So this gets her thinking that she is all of a sudden
Clock is ticking.
desiring to be younger, and she finds this thing called the substance, where if she takes it, she will become there will be a version of her who will pop out and live her life or live a life for 7 days. And then that person will need to go back in the closet or whatever, and the older character can then live the life. And it's a really, really curious
Live like
movie.
the reset life?
Yeah, so essentially they are the same person technically. The
Right.
people who do the substance, they remind them, you are the same person, but they are actually two different people.
Right.
This younger version of the Demi Moore character actually takes Demi Moore's job. Essentially. And so as the movie goes on, an increasing rivalry between the younger character and the older character takes place. It is a really clever way to explore the issues of aging, particularly if you're a woman and aging within a society that so values beauty and youth.
Yep.
So because of that, it has some really interesting things to say, but man, how it says it is crazy.
Bonkers.
Crazy. Just to give you one idea, this facsimile of the Demi Moore character pops out of her back
As a full-grown human.
as a full-grown
And it's
human.
pretty graphic from what I took from your review as well.
Yes, this is not a pretty thing, and it really goes downhill from there. I mean, that is really just the beginning of
and
the
there's
crazy train
a
here.
ton of nudity too, right?
Tons and tons of nudity. It is. You see
Not a ton, tons and tons.
tons and tons.
Multiple tons.
You see
tons.
much skin, and that makes it clearly very problematic. And some of that skin is meant to be objectified because of the themes of the movie. They definitely do objectify, especially the younger character here. So it can feel incredibly salacious. It can feel incredibly tawdry. It is extraordinarily violent in places and bloody and just flat out weird.
Isn't it part of sort of an emerging genre called body horror?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah.
so it's they've had to come up with a
Yeah.
new descriptor for horror that is somehow related to the body. It's pretty self-evident now that I think about it.
Well, I guess I think of movies like The Fly or
Yeah.
others of the like that have been done in the past. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that those movies were necessarily viewed as like peak Oscar contenders when award
until
season
now.
rolled around. So there's a bit of a shift that's going on
Yeah.
there.
So now that we've spent like 25 minutes just doing our litany,
What
we're
a
now
movie.
ready for the real conversation. So we'll take a break so that you can get a cup of coffee for round 2. So I'm just going to toss it open and let's just talk surprises, snubs, or things that are most significant. And actually, I think I want to start with the latter.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to circle back to a couple things you noted, Paul, that with the R ratings here comes some extreme content and some extreme sexual content.
Right.
And I know we had talked a little bit offline about that, but I'll maybe throw that over to you and then we can talk about some of the other things that popped out this year.
As it were. Yeah.
As it were.
When you look at this, when you look at the slate of some of these Oscar contenders, we really are looking at a a lot of movies are exploring the themes of sexuality. You know, even The Brutalist it dabbles a little bit in that, right? But especially when you're talking about Nora, Amelia Perez, Conclave, and The Substance, which we just talked about, those all deal with sexuality and the human body in different sorts of ways. Now, those are viable themes that movies can deal with, but when they manifest themselves in movies like these, they can have incredibly shocking content. And the other thing, of course, is that these movies push away from sort of that idea of how God designed us, you know.
Because we're seeing sexuality brutalized in all kinds of ways, right?
Right. And I think Conclave, one of the interesting things about that movie is it squarely takes on that traditional understanding of sexuality head on.
Yeah.
You know, they are really talking about how if the church survives, it needs to adjust how it deals with these sexual issues. And no doubt, these sexual issues are huge issues. But when you look at factions of the churches that have softened their stance on some of the stuff to make it more inclusive, it makes it less relevant, I think. You know, you move away from God's teaching. It doesn't ultimately do us much good.
Yeah.
Right. I was just going to say, to your point, Paul, it leads further and further and further away from the faith, the foundational faith, as we try to chase after, okay, what's relevant today, right? Until, well, the faith doesn't look much different from secularism, so why do I need the faith? Right?
Yeah, when I think about moving away from some of those aspects, the traditional aspects of faith, it's a little like food. This is going to be a strange comparison, right? But,
I can't wait for this.
But, you know, you have a great steak dinner, right? Or something like that. There are people who don't like steak, so I don't like steak. So if you're a chef who really wants to include everybody, they say, okay, so what can I do that will appeal to this group of people? And eventually, when you start appealing to all of those sorts of things, as opposed to just, you know, what the food is designed to be, all of a sudden you just have a big bunch of tasteless mush, and no one cares to have tasteless mush. And sometimes I think that when we lead toward the church toward downplaying some of these traditional values, it turns it into mush that no one says, that people just say, why is this relevant to me?
Yeah. And the cynic in me, especially with a movie like The Substance, when it came out, my first thought was, this is Academy Awards bait of the highest order, because extreme gets people's attention. And so on one hand, I'm really interested in the themes that are in this movie. On the other hand, I have no desire, just, you know, me, myself as Adam moviegoer, to be exposed to that content for the sake of having a conversation about those themes. And I've said this before, I haven't said it recently, but I remember after I saw American Beauty in 1999, I thought that was a brilliant depiction of depravity. And it sounds like we've got some things in here. Maybe depravity is the wrong word, but fallenness, the intersection of our fallenness with our humanity, especially as it relates to sex. But the other thing I thought was, I don't need to see a brilliant depiction of these things to know that there are issues here, right?
Right. There's something to be said for, hey, I'm gonna watch a challenging movie, right? And it's going to force me to wrestle through some pretty serious themes, ideas, but you can have a movie that's serious without a lot of salacious, shocking content issues in it as well. And it feels like that's being missed in some ways too. As you mentioned about like awards bait, oh, well, this is shocking, so it's going to get attention, right?
Well, in the last number of years, we've seen a number of actresses that have had extraordinarily sexually explicit roles. And every time I see it, I'm like, well, she's going to get nominated for an Academy Award. And so ironically, even as Hollywood often decries the objectification of women, it continues to absolutely do it because it keeps selling. And so, one of the paradoxes of The Substance is here we have a movie about the objectification of women that objectifies women from start to finish, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
Right.
That's really true. The other thing that I find interesting, especially about this slate of Oscar nominees, and this is not a new thing,
Right.
but it seems to me that more and more Oscar voters, they're almost voting as much for issues as they are about the movie itself. Right? You have these hot button issues that people feel really need to be talked about. And so a movie deals with those topics, and so it gets applause.
Right.
Whether it's a good
Like
movie or
Amelia
not.
Perez getting the most nominations.
Amelia Perez
it's
getting
the
the most
issue of our
nominations.
day, the trans thing, right?
It's a huge issue.
one of
Now,
them.
that's not to say that Amelia Perez is a bad movie, because
Right.
it's a well-constructed movie. But would it have gotten the Oscar attention had it not been for those powerful issues? I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. So as we think about surprises or snubs, are there things on here that it's like, well, that shouldn't have been here? Or are there some glaring misses that people are gasping that can't believe that didn't get a nomination? What have you guys seen just in some of the coverage and even some of the movies we've seen?
I was surprised that Sing Sing didn't get a nomination
Right,
for
you
Best
did mention
Picture.
that.
I do think that there were a lot of really good movies that were sort of overlooked. Another one that we've talked about is for Exhibiting Forgiveness, which I thought was a really strong movie.
Yep.
There are movies that are often, my favorite movies often are the ones that are sort of in that 11 to 20 range of movies. Movies that almost made the
So
cut,
close.
but
Just
not
missed the
quite.
cut.
Yeah, so I think that there were a lot of movies that I would have liked to have seen.
Yeah.
I was surprised the Dune director didn't make.
I was too.
Yep.
It's because nobody can pronounce his name. It's Denis
Did you notice?
Villeneuve.
Yeah, did you
You
notice
gotta
that I
do
just
the,
said the Dune director? I wasn't even going to try
Let him
to
try.
say that.
Yeah, I guess I was a little surprised that Wicked made it
I
on
was
the
surprised
list.
by Wicked.
Because and honestly, it's nothing against Wicked to all the Wicked fans out there, but I think it was just because
What happened to Brett? He's gone.
He's gone.
They came for him.
the Wicked coalition got him. But sometimes the Academy doesn't necessarily tend to trend toward movies that seem more of just like pop culture kind of
Yeah.
moments. Instead choosing to focus on other movies, maybe with, again, some of these content issues, things like that. So I was interested to see that crack the list.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had the thought again, and this is my cynicism. I'm like, well, we picked all these weirdo movies. We got to throw them a bone with something they actually saw, and most of them liked, except for Adam. He didn't like it really at all.
Dune and Wicked, those are the two, I think, kind of populist choices there.
Yeah.
right?
So,
That's true.
man, I feel like we could just keep going. I have one more thing I want to slide in here because, Brett, you and I were talking a little bit, and your observation, and this next thing I'm going to say could be another whole podcast into and unto itself. The more interesting list, or a differently interesting list, is the animated movies list, right? We've got
I think so.
Flow, which you loved Flow.
I loved Flow.
Paul loved all of these.
mean,
Let's
it's
just say that from the right.
Inside Out 2, Memoir of a Snail, which I don't think we've covered.
We have not covered.
But it's
Another
coming. Paul's going to
glaring
see it
omission.
tonight.
I'm sure
probably.
Paul will love it when he sees it.
Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul,
Yep.
and The Wild Robot. I mean, a couple of those we've already talked about. It's interesting to me, and I suppose not surprising.
Yeah.
Man, the animated category feels way more accessible than the Best Picture list does.
Accessible, and I would argue when I look at the lists, aside from a few exceptions here or there, I would almost say that the animated features, I would bet that they're more resonant.
Yeah.
I would imagine that those more are movies, not just because of the accessibility for families, but because of the messages
Yeah.
and what they're trying to say, right? The themes of those movies really connect with people and connect in a powerful and positive way.
Yeah.
Right.
You mentioned
Not Demi Moore giving birth to somebody out of her back.
right, or Honora, where the main character ends up, spoiler, worse than she started in a lot of ways, right? So you go to those animated features, I could really see those are the movies that people will be talking about popping in years from now. Hey, can we watch Wallace and Gromit again? Can we watch
Right.
Flow? Can we watch Inside Out 2, right?
Right.
And I
I
think
just
that
feel like
says
watching
something.
Amelia Perez tonight.
Right,
Probably
but
not.
I think that says something. There's nothing wrong with like a challenging movie that makes you think, but man,
Well, and
I just think, yeah, go ahead.
No, it gets to Paul's thought that movies are less about, or the ones that are honored maybe aren't the best stories, but issues related.
Well,
Right.
and I do think that animated movies are inherently overlooked by Hollywood. You know, these are well-crafted stories. These are not just animated movies. These are beautiful movies. And sometimes because we think of them as quote unquote being made for kids, we overlook them. You know, I think back earlier, several months ago, you and I were sitting down, Inside Out 2 had just come out. We had a podcast about it.
Yeah.
We both loved
Loved it.
Inside Out 2. And it was a great movie. Now that it's the end of the year, that's fourth on my list of these 5 nominees. That's amazing when you think about the quality, the resonance, as you say, Brett, of these stories and the power and beauty of the storytelling itself. Man, I think animated movies are where it's at.
I think it's more difficult to make a movie that has those themes and that resonance, that is equally accessible for kids and adults.
Yeah.
I think that's harder to do that than to make a movie where you just lean into the most salacious type of shocking stuff you can to get a point across.
Absolutely. When you look at a movie like The Substance, the content in it is going to draw attention. It's almost like that kid in the back of class who, you know, drops his pants or whatnot to say, "Look at me." You know,
You got at him.
You know,
You really got him with that.
I didn't know where you were going, but that wasn't what I was
really
expecting.
It's sort of some of these movies really want your attention, and they will do anything to get it. The animated movies this year, they get it through their value. They get it through their storytelling. They get it through their beautiful imagery. And those are the movies, to get to your point, Brett, is that we're going to come back to again and again. I don't think Anora, Amelia Perez, these are going to be huge draws 20 years from now.
Yeah.
But Inside Out 2, The Wild Robot, people are going to be watching those.
They will have a shelf life. So I really wish we could keep talking because honestly, this is such a fun conversation. And not only that, I think it's an important conversation. And we focus a lot about movies because movies have the power to influence our culture. And I just want to sort of stick the landing with a quote from Walt Mueller, who is a youth culture expert. And he says, movies and entertainment in general serves as a mirror and a map. The mirror reflects what's happening in culture. The map shows us here's where we're going. And so it's important, even if you don't see most of these movies, and frankly, maybe you shouldn't see most of these movies, they are still reflecting where we're at culturally, and they're influencing the ongoing trajectory. And that's why we talk about it, because they influence our families, they influence our kids, sometimes in ways that we're not even aware of. And we feel like there's value in you at least being aware of it, even if probably after this conversation, you can cross The Substance off your list for this year. So thanks, guys. Well, in our second segment today, Bret Eckelberry remains with us after our first segment to talk about the new movie Green and Gold. And it sounds like a very colorful movie, but it doesn't tell me anything about what it actually is. So if I were green and gold, what would I be?
What would you be? Well, so in short, Green and Gold is really a story about a farmer and his granddaughter.
I was hoping there wasn't Adele in there.
No. They so this farmer and his granddaughter, they kind of have a rocky relationship. The daughter wants to pursue a career in music.
Okay.
Her mother did something very similar, much to the grandfather's chagrin. So there's a little bit of tension.
And I'm guessing it
between
didn't
them
go well for the mother.
Didn't go well. She's actually dead. And when this movie
the
kicks
ultimate
off,
form of not going well.
you're right. The movie is really about their relationship together. The farm is facing foreclosure as well. So they actually end up taking a bet with the bank that the Green Bay Packers, of which they are big-time fans, will go all the way and win the Super Bowl. And if they do that, then they'll get an extra year to pay off the money they owe on the farm.
So did they pick the year to correspond with when that happened last?
I'm not going to spoil that.
Okay.
They have a very good season.
Okay.
So this is set back in the 90s. Brett Favre is the quarterback.
Okay. So
for
there's
football
hope.
fans out there.
Is this based on a true story?
It is based on a true story.
And
yes.
the bank made a bet with them? This only happens in small town banks.
Exactly.
Like, Bank of America is not, making bets.
Right,
with people.
right. I don't think it was Bank of America. I don't think it was Capital One, anything
None
like
of
that.
those.
So yeah, local bank, but really it's about the granddaughter pursuing that career in music. She thinks, hey, this might be a way that we could pay off some of the debt. Again, the grandfather doesn't want her going down that path.
Yeah.
He is very focused on trying to do the right thing, take care of the land, but he's got some issues too that he needs to work through as they come back together. So yeah, I would say there's elements of faith. I would say it's a Christian adjacent film.
Did you like it?
I did like it.
Okay.
I thought it was very good. A very sweet film about stubborn people working together.
I like it already.
Coming together really to lean on the help of others.
Okay.
Helping each other, and then accepting help from the community as well, the community of faith, and then the larger community of the town that's around them.
And the reality is, and I say this as somebody who grew up in Iowa and came from 2 farming families, hardworking, sometimes we can be independent to a fault.
Yeah.
Right? We want to solve the problem ourselves, and you don't have to come from a farming family to have that character trait necessarily.
Right.
But it actually kind of intrigues me,
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. I would say that is kind of the main conflict. The grandfather, Buck is his name. He really goes out of his way. The movie shows us he goes out of his way to help people. He's happy to do it. He's replacing, say, the water heater for the church. He's going and helping out those who maybe are less fortunate than him, but he has a really hard time accepting help himself to a fault, right? And so the movie definitely kind of wrangles with that. And then it frames the movie within the context of this Green Bay Packers season, where, I mean, you're invested. If you're not a Green Bay Packers fan, if you watch this movie,
You will be.
You will be for at least the 2-hour runtime, right? Because you're hoping and praying, okay, I hope that the Packers pull this off, because that holds the fate of these characters that we care about in their hands as well.
So PG-13?
PG.
Okay.
Yep. There's some language.
Yeah, I was going to say, everything we've said so far has been kind of glowing. So what issues do we need to be
There
aware
are
of?
some issues in it. Language is one, including one S word that surprised me for a movie like this.
Okay.
A few abuses of God's name as well. So there's some language issues. We see Grandpa Buck with his shirt off, with his skivvies on a couple times as he works out in the morning, does his calisthenics.
Oh, wow.
A few things like that. Those
things I can't unsee, even with that description.
Yes, exactly. Sorry to give you that mental picture.
But good to know.
But good to know. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
So it's the workout scene.
So definitely a few issues going in the family should know, but for the most part, I would say pretty navigable.
Yeah.
And definitely warm toward faith and prayer. We see characters asking God for help in the midst of some seemingly hopeless situations as well. And we see characters' hearts turn a little more Godward, I'd say, as the film goes on.
That sounds great. Well, I think we've covered what we need to do here. So, Brett, thank you for telling us about Green and Gold, and that is in theaters.
My pleasure, yeah.
Thanks, Brett. So now it's time for a segment of the Plugged In show we call The Game.
Is that what we call it?
No. We actually have a bunch of games we
trademark.
play, and this one, it's the dad joke episode.
Yay.
And I'm a dad, and I love dad jokes. And let me just say, my youngest daughter this year for Christmas gave me something that I will treasure for the rest of my life.
Okay.
She made me a hand-drawn book of dad jokes.
Oh,
And
that's so sweet.
she
That's
loves
cool.
dad jokes. So she looks them up because she takes great joy in them.
That's great.
And so, can I start us off?
You can start us
Please.
off.
You ready?
I am so ready.
Okay.
You can't start laughing at your joke before you even tell it.
Watch me. What's red and bad for your teeth?
What's red and bad for your teeth?
A brick. Now, here's one that's not quite as violent. What's green and has wheels? Grass. I lied about the wheels.
Oh my
Those are both courtesy of my daughter.
Wow.
And I think
good job,
I love
daughter.
Our
those
compliments on
jokes.
that,
I will
that's
pass them
great.
along
That's
to
great.
her. I'll say you can watch this podcast. If you watch long enough, you'll hear your joke. And I'm like, give her $10 if she makes it that far. Brett, what you got?
I've got one. Okay. Why does everyone hate debating the Scarecrow?
I don't know.
Because he's always making straw man arguments.
Oh, I like it.
Wow,
I
that's
like it.
really good. Really good.
Paul?
Sorta. Okay.
The value of a
hater.
dad joke
Yeah.
is in how hard you get a groan from it.
Right?
Yeah, that's
That
part
is
of
exactly. And
part of the fun.
Well, it is true.
if you can laugh at your own dad joke, that's also a part of the shtick,
Yeah.
right? I don't care
That's
if you
the
think
only
it's funny or
requirement.
not.
Yeah.
A brick. Paul, over to you.
All right. So what did Snow White say when she kept going back to the printer again and again and again?
I don't know.
Someday my prince will come.
There you go.
You know, of all the games we play here at Plugged In, this one may have just become my favorite. I thank you for a little bit of levity. And, you know, it's a beautiful thing to laugh. And hopefully it's a beautiful thing to listen to the Plugged In show each week. And I hope that as you have listened to us talk about the Oscar nominees this week, and as Brett has told us about Green and Gold, there have been places of connection for you. And so we love talking and we love hearing from you. So what was your favorite film last year? What did you think of the Oscar nomination list? You can let us know a couple different ways. You can shoot us an email, old school, team@thepluggedinshow.com, or click the black ribbon on the Plugged In Show landing page, and you can leave us a voicemail, and we might even use, your voice
You never know.
in a future show. We would love to do that. And finally, we are always up for a good conversation on Instagram and Facebook. Well, thanks again for choosing to spend some time with us this week. We know in this crazy world of ever expanding content, what is there, like 1 billion more hours on YouTube every day, something crazy. You have a lot of choices, and we are honored that you've spent that time with us. We love being here with you, and we look forward to joining you again next week on another episode of The Plugged In Show.